find applications in real life. And what I want to do is to walk you through some example applications from visual neuroscience, something that is very closely related to my PhD work. Also on color blindness detection, this is something that I learned as a part of a data analytics course at the Indian Institute of Science. And this is also something from the industry. So you will be seeing what exactly happens in the industry. And then there is also a very recent COVID-19 modeling effort that took place at IASC. There was a team from TIFR Mumbai as well, which joined hands with one team from IASC. Particularly, some of my lab mates were involved in this particular modeling effort. So I would like to walk you through three examples like this. And I would like to tell you where exactly probability distributions, probabilistic modeling actually comes into play. So I would like to dedicate this talk to this man here. He is a great gentleman. He is perhaps, it may not be too much to tell that he is the father of modern mathematical statistics. One of the few names from India that you will see in many of the theorems in mathematics and statistics, Professor C.R. Rao. So Professor C.R. Rao, just to give a very small background about him, he was actually born in Ballari, but then he moved to Vishakhapatnam for his schooling, and then he went on to do his master's in Andhra Pradesh University. And then later on, he went to Calcutta University and got an MA in statistics. And finally, if you all have heard of Fisher's name in statistics, he went on to do PhD at Cambridge University with Fisher. And then he came back to ISI. So he was at ISI Kolkata for many years. Although I have not personally interacted with Professor C.R. Rao, I have had the opportunity to know another very great Rao, which is Y. Gopal Rao from RV College. So I don't think it will be too much to say that it's a great pleasure for all of us to, have people like these, people like the two Raos here at the helm of affairs, teaching us how to lead life, and then how to get to the pinnacle of their own fields. So Professor C.R. Rao celebrated his centenary on September 10th this year. There was a very nice video that was brought out. I urge all of you to watch that video. It is available on YouTube. So so this is about C.R. Rao, and I think much of what we study today in probability or statistics, I think we should owe it to this man. So there are many theorems in his name. For example, there is something called the Rao-Blackwell theorem. There is also something called the Kramer-Rao lower bound, which is very, very famous in statistics. So all of these are named after C.R. Rao. Okay. So let me start with some, some idea. Let me give you an idea of how probability actually started. So it was 1718, a time that was, very nice. There was no pandemic like this. And then, there were people who were appearing for the Tripos exam in Europe, just like how we appeared for Karnataka CET. And then people used to cherish those times when they could, boast of having passed the Tripos exam, because it was, I believe, a 3 or 5 day exam. A very detailed account of that is present in Srinivasa Ramanujan's book written by Isaacson. So, the mathematicians of those days had to appear for this Tripos exam and clear that in order to obtain a degree in mathematics. So as much as we cherish having secured good ranks in Karnataka CET and having obtained a seat in the EC department of RV College, so those people used to cherish passing the Tripos exam. So it was that nice era. So it was 1718, and then these two gentlemen, Bernoulli, who was a Swiss mathematician, and then Abraham de Moivre, who was a French mathematician, both around the same time, they independently came up with this notion of probability as a chance of occurrence. So what did they actually say? Suppose an experiment E is repeated many, many, many times. Okay, let's say capital N times, where capital N is typically of the order of 10,000 or even 1 lakh or more than that. Okay, and then these gentlemen said, okay, so now that you have repeated this experiment many times, in each of these repetitions, you either see the event E occurring, some event E occurring, or you don't see the event E occurring. And then they said the probability of the event E is then the number of times this occurs over those n trials divided by capital N. Okay, so of course this is a number between 0 and 1. The maximum value that this can take is 1. And this, they called it as the frequentist notion of probability. Okay. So this was as early as 1718 when they were trying to conceive what probability actually means. But then, as much as these Swiss and French mathematicians were happy about this notion of probability, there were also these German and English mathematicians of those days who were opposed to this idea of computing probabilities via frequentist approach. So this is called a frequentist approach because this probability is calculated as a relative frequency, as a ratio of the number of times of favorable outcomes to the total number of outcomes. So the English and German mathematicians of those days were opposed to this idea, primarily because some experiments cannot be repeated multiple times. As many times as 10 to the 5, for example, as many times that we would like it to happen. For example, let's say the appearance of Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet, as you know, appears once in 75 to 76 years. And then if you want to predict the most likely place on Earth where this Halley's Comet will be visible, I mean, if you want to compute such a probability based on the data, the chances are that you won't have too much of data unless somebody has recorded it over all the previous years. Similarly, a pandemic breakout, you cannot expect a pandemic to break out as many times as you would like, so that you have like 10 to the 5 data points to compute probabilities. So there was a need for a theory, a mathematical theory that could enable one to carry out analysis without the need to go back to this frequentist approach, without the need to carry out experiments, without the need to look at probabilities in terms of relative frequencies and things like that. Okay. So by the way, if you have any doubts, please stop me and you can unmute yourselves and ask questions. Okay. So please keep this as interactive as possible. There is no hurry whatsoever that I have to complete all the slides. So I just want you to take away whatever little I'm telling you. Okay. So please feel free to stop and ask questions. So at this time, we should, perhaps revisit history, and then we should give credit to these two mathematicians, Émile Borel and Henri Lebesgue. These two are French mathematicians. So it's about 176 years after, Bernoulli and Abraham Demore came up with their theory. About 176 years later, Émile Borel had a PhD student by name Henri Lebesgue, and then both of them together came up with this subject of measure theory. In fact, there is something called Lebesgue integrals. Okay, and then the integrals that you are learning now to compute. I think in M1 to M4 in the first 4 semesters, you have perhaps learned a lot of integration, and even during your +1 and +2, you have learned to do a lot of integration. Now the point is that those integrals, you never bothered about whether the integrals can be computed in the first place or not. Whether the functions that were present as integrands could be integrated or not is something that you never worried about. You were already told that this integral is computable. You just have to find out the means to compute that integral. But it so turns out that the mathematicians of those days came up with some examples of functions for which the integrals could not be computed the way we are used to computing integrals. So a new theory of integration was necessary. So just as a matter of fact, the theory of integration that all of you know, the way you are performing integrals, that is what is called Riemann integration. Okay. So Lebesgue came up with his own theory of integration, which is much more broader and more general than than Riemann integrals. So every function which is Lebesgue integrable is automatic. Every function which is Riemann integrable is also Lebesgue integrable. Lebesgue is more general. There are some functions which are only Lebesgue integrable but not Riemann integrable. Okay. So yeah, so these two gentlemen here came up with this subject of measure theory, and what this measure theory did was that it was an axiomatic theory. Okay, it was based on some fundamental axioms. So when we say axioms, these are like God-given truths. Okay, they just formulated 2 or 3 axioms, and then the whole theory was formulated based on those axioms. Now, the beauty of these axioms was that in 1933, this Russian mathematician by name Kolmogorov was able to borrow the key concepts from these axioms and specifically formulate a new theory called probability theory. Okay, so what we know today as this rich theory of probability, we should owe it to Andrei Kolmogorov and his previous, and his and Henry and Lebesgue and Borel. Okay. So what this theory does is basically it just starts off with some axioms, and then it completely gets rid of the need to think of probabilities in terms of relative frequencies. Even if you are not able to compute the probabilities exactly, if you know that there is some probability out there, the value of which you don't know because you have not been able to carry out experiments, even then, because that probability value exists as a number, it exists. You may not be able to compute it, but it exists. Merely based on such existential rules, you can carry out analysis. Okay. So Kolmogorov was the one who came up with that kind of a theory. So as Kolmogorov says in his words, the theory of probability should be developed from axioms, just like how geometry was developed by Euclid, for example. How geometry and algebra are developed from axioms. In the same way, the theory of probability should be developed as an axiomatic theory, is what Kolmogorov said. So much of what we know about probability today, all the CDF, PDF, PMF, discrete random variables, continuous random variables, everything you can trace it back to either Borel, Lebesgue, or Kolmogorov. Okay, so they were the ones who started this theory, and we only touch the surface of this theory as engineers. Okay, but mathematicians deal with this theory in much more detail. Okay, so what I thought I'll do is I'll set the context. I'll just very briefly, very quickly walk you through some basics from probability that I will be using in the subsequent slides. So as all of you know, there is this central concept of random variables in probability. What are random variables? To be very simple, these are just quantities whose values are uncertain and they may not be known in advance. Okay, so you just model them as random variables. For example, the number of spikes which are generated in the optic nerve when you look at a certain image. Okay, so the neuroscientists have found out that each image generates a different set of spikes, in the sense it generates spikes at a different rate. Okay, so these spikes are all electrical these reactions that happen within the neurons, and then the electrical messages which are passed on. Okay, so the number of spikes which are generated in the optical nerve when looking at an image, that is a random variable. Or let's say the incubation period of a patient who is exposed to the COVID-19 virus. Incubation period in the sense for how long does he actually hold the virus, and then the time until he starts to show symptoms. Okay, so that is a random variable. Okay, and then the strength of the signal which is received at a receiver antenna, for example. Okay, so all these are random variables. Okay, and typically all of these are real value. Okay, so you just model something that you don't know, something whose value you don't know, as a random variable, and then there is this concept of a CDF that you can associate it with each random variable. Okay, so what is a CDF? A CDF is just a function from the real line to the interval 0, 1. And what does it do? It's a function, so it eats something and spits out something. So what does it eat? It eats a real number x. And what does it spit out? It spits out the probability with which the random variable x takes values smaller than or equal to x. Okay. So if you see, the probability is a number between 0 and 1, and therefore the range of the function fx is the interval 0 to 1. Okay, so all this is nice. So there are two types of random variables, as you all know, two or maybe even three. Discrete random variables, continuous random variables, and then mixed random variables. Mixed in the sense they are both discrete as well as continuous. Okay, so I won't touch upon discrete random variables. Sorry, I won't touch upon mixed random variables. Let's just concentrate on discrete and continuous. So what's a discrete random variable? A discrete random variable is a random variable which takes either only finitely many values, like the outcomes of a coin toss, or it takes countably infinitely many values. Okay, so when I say countably infinite, so the thing is that when you say infinitely many values, there are two types of infinities that you have to talk about. One is countably infinite, like the set of natural numbers, the set of real numbers, sorry, the set of rational numbers. All these are countably infinite. Uncountably infinite is the set of real numbers. So you can see the difference, right? On the set of natural numbers, there are gaps in between, but in the set of reals, there are no gaps. It's a continuum. So there are these two types of infinities. One is called countable infinity, like the set of naturals and the rationals, and the other is a set of uncountable infinity, which is the set of reals. Okay, so a random variable which takes either finite or countably infinitely many values is known as a discrete random variable. So, for example, yes.
Could you give an example for mixed random variables?
So what happens is, there will be some random variables, which take the value. Like for example, there is something called a Bernoulli Gaussian. I don't know if you have heard of this. A Bernoulli Gaussian is with probability. So I'll just come to that. Okay, I'll just talk about this Bernoulli distribution and I'll come to that. Okay, so just hold on to that question. So yeah, so I was talking about discrete random variables. Some examples: the number of people who turn up for a live seminar like this. We don't know how many will turn up, and then the number of fair coin tosses until the pattern HTH is observed for the first time. That is a random variable. Okay, in fact, that is a countably infinitely valued random variable. Correct? You don't know how many tosses. It can happen in 3 tosses. It can happen in 4 tosses, 5 tosses, 6 tosses. So it's a countably infinitely valued random variable, whereas the number of people, hopefully, it is finite. Okay, there is no concept of accommodating countably infinitely many valued people because the population of Earth is finite. Okay. So suppose X is a discrete random variable, then its PMF, or the probability mass function, similar to the CDF, it is also a function which eats a real number and spits out the probability that the value of the random variable is equal to this real number. Okay, so it eats an X and spits out the probability that the random variable X, capital X, takes the value small x. Okay, so similarly, okay, so let's now just look at some important PMFs. So one is the Bernoulli distribution. Typically, Bernoulli distribution is associated with outcomes 0 or 1. It's like the tail or the head of a coin. Okay, and the Bernoulli distribution is characterized by a single parameter P, as all of you know, and the PMF is given as on the slide. A slightly more general version of this is the binomial distribution. So a Bernoulli distribution just counts how many heads appeared in a single toss. Either 1 head can appear or 0 head can appear. Whereas a binomial distribution tries to count how many heads appeared in n successive tosses of a coin. Okay, n tosses of a coin. So it is characterized by 2 parameters. How many times did you toss the coin? And what was the probability of the coin showing heads? So both of these parameters. And then the PMF is as given here. So if you set n is equal to 1, okay, and then when I say n is equal to 1, the values taken are either 0 or 1. It's like that. Okay, so a binomial distribution takes n plus 1 values in all from 0 to n. So if you set n is equal to 1, it comes back, it just comes back to the Bernoulli distribution. That is, in one toss, how many heads did you get? That is the Bernoulli distribution. Now there is a slightly more general version of a binomial distribution. See, in a binomial distribution, suppose you toss a coin n times. In each toss, you could get only 2 outcomes: head or tail, head or tail, head or tail, like that. But now let's say there are n people in a theater, and then let's say there are 3 doors in a theater, okay, as exits. And you want to compute how many people will go out through door 1, how many people will go out through door 2, how many people will go out through door 3, okay? Now, of course, as you can see here, the total number of people who exit all the doors is equal to the total number of people inside the theater. And if you want to compute the probability like this is what is called a multinomial distribution. Okay, it's a slightly more general version. If there were 2 doors, it is binomial distribution. If there are more than 2 doors, it's a multinomial distribution. Okay, so what I've written here is there are n people, capital L doors, and then x1 through x capital L are the random variables representing the number of people who exit each of these capital L doors. Okay, so the joint PMF of this is something like this. Okay, so it's characterized by the number of people n, the number of doors capital L, and then the probabilities with which the people exit these doors, P1 through P capital L. Okay, and this is the PMF that you can see. And then there is also another very important distribution, which is called the Poisson distribution. Poisson is characterized by a real parameter lambda, which is strictly positive, and it is a countably infinite valued random variable. Okay, so for example, the number of spikes which are generated in the optical nerve when you look at a certain image, neuroscientists have found that this number, the number of spikes, is a Poisson random variable. It is a non-negative integer valued random variable. So when I say number of spikes, the number of spikes can be 0, it can be 1, 2, 3, 100, 10 million, you don't know how many. Okay, so it is a potentially countably infinitely valued random variable, and the PMF is as given here. Okay, so I'm pretty sure all of you know about these distributions. I'm just trying to give you some small examples of where these come. So one example of a Poisson distribution you should remember is the spikes you observe in the optical nerve when you are looking at a certain image. Okay, so the number of spikes that are generated on an average which is the mean of the Poisson random variable that I'm talking about. Okay, so the average number of spikes is a characteristic of the image you are looking at. So if you're looking at one person, there is a certain average number of spikes that are generated. If you're looking at some other person, there is a certain other average number of spikes which are generated. And typically, this average number of spikes is something that is unique to the image that you're observing. Okay. Okay, so and then there are these continuous random variables. So of course, the way we learn it in bachelor's is that a random variable is continuous if the CDF is continuous, more so if it's differentiable. Okay, but there is a very rigorous term for what a continuous random variable means. A random variable is said to be continuous if its CDF is what is called absolutely continuous, not just continuous or differentiable. It has to be absolutely continuous. It's like continuous is one end, differentiable is another end, absolutely continuous sits somewhere in between. Okay, continuity is not enough. Differentiability is too strict. It's too much of an imposition. Absolute continuity is the right imposition for saying that a random variable is continuous. So don't worry about absolute continuity for now. Okay, it is a concept from measure theory, but a random variable is said to be continuous if its CDF is absolutely continuous. Okay, not the random variable itself being continuous. There is no concept of a random variable being continuous. The CDF of the random variable has to be absolutely continuous or differentiable. Let's take that it is differentiable for now. Okay. So once it is differentiable, you all know that you can compute the PDF, and the PDF is just a derivative at every point where the CDF is differentiable. Okay, so let's assume for now that the CDF is differentiable everywhere, like the Gaussian CDF, for example. Okay, so there's this Gaussian distribution. If you look at the Gaussian CDF is differentiable everywhere, and the PDF for every real number x is like this. Okay, so the Gaussian distribution, as you all know, is characterized by two parameters. One is called the mean, and another is called the standard deviation, or some people also refer to that as the variance. They try to refer to sigma square and mu as the parameters of a Gaussian distribution. So it's a real valued distribution. Okay, recall that Bernoulli was only 0 and 1. Binomial was 0, 1, 2, n. Multinomial also was 0, 1, 2, n. Poisson was 0, 1, 2, 3 up to it just goes on. Okay, it's non-negative integer value, whereas Gaussian is on both sides of the real line. Okay, so it's a real valued random variable. Okay, so there is also this exponential distribution. So okay, so some examples for Gaussian, as you all know, there is this Gaussian, the additive white Gaussian noise, which very famously comes in all communication applications. And one reason why Gaussian comes there is because, you know, all these small little noises that are generated in the environment, like the spark plug of your vehicle, like the motors running in an industry, okay, all of these little noises, there are so many sources that are generating all these little noises, and when they all add up together, okay, it has the effect that a Gaussian noise would have. Okay, in the sense, when you add up all of these noises together, and if you look at the distribution of that joint or that additive noise, then that collective noise, if you look at the distribution of that will follow a Gaussian distribution. Okay, in the limit as the number of sources generating these noises is very large. Okay, for a very large number of sources generating these little spikes, little noises, if you add all of them together, the cumulative effect is that of a Gaussian distribution. So that is why Gaussian plays a very central role in communications. And of course, there are many other places where Gaussian naturally comes. For example, if you take a big sack of sand or cement or something like that, and if you pour it, if you just empty the contents of that sack on the road, you can see that it just forms a hill. Okay, there is a natural Gaussian way of distribution that all of these follow. Okay, so Gaussian is as natural as it can get. So there is also this exponential distribution, which is a very important distribution. So you will see this exponential distribution come at many places later on in the talk. Okay, so it is characterized by a single parameter. Note that exponential distribution is a non-negative valued random variable. It takes values only on the positive half of the real line. Okay, and this is the PDF. So exponential distribution is typically used for modeling the lifetime. Okay, lifetime of an electric bulb, for example. Okay, the lifetime of an electric bulb, or even the amount of time for that, for example, a Facebook server will take to serve your request for accessing somebody's profile or something like that. So server request times are typically exponentially distributed. Okay, So there is also this very important gamma distribution, which is characterized by two parameters, okay, alpha and beta. And then the PDF is something like this. So what I have taken as beta here is what is called the rate parameter. Sometimes people use 1 by beta as the parameter of the gamma distribution. And in that case, 1 by beta will be called the scale parameter. Okay. So if you look at Wikipedia, for example, there are two forms of the PDF. One is in terms of the scale parameter and one is in terms of the rate parameter. And the scale and the rate parameters are related as inverse of each other. Okay. Again, this is also a non-negative valued random variable. So if you ask me, where do you use gamma? Where do you use exponential? Just wait for it. I will tell you in the later half of the talk. Okay. And of course, all of you know uniform distribution. It has a finite support. Okay. When I say finite support, it is supported on a finite interval. Okay. The random variable takes real values. It takes uncountably many values, but in a bounded interval. Okay. And the PDF is as shown here. Okay. So there are many other examples that I have left out. I have just emphasized on some things like the gamma distribution and the exponential distribution and the multinomial, which you will see later on in the talk. Okay. So there was one question regarding a mixed random variable. So there is something called a Bernoulli Gaussian. Okay, a Bernoulli Gaussian is also used in communication theory. Now, a Bernoulli Gaussian is something like this. If the random variable, so imagine a random variable x, okay, it takes the value 0 with some probability p, let's say half. Okay, it takes the value 0 with probability half, but it is equal to a Gaussian with probability half. Now, where do you encounter such things? For example, let's say at the receiver, you have a switch. Okay, the switch is either on or off. Okay, if it is off, then you receive 0 volts. If it is on, you receive the received signal. And let's say the received signal is just noise. Okay, there is nothing in the receiver yet. The receiver antenna is just receiving noise, for example. Okay, so the noise is typically, as I said, AWGN, it's Gaussian. So if the switch is on, which happens, let's say with probability half, you just receive the received signal, which is Gaussian. If the switch is off, which again happens with probability half, you just receive 0 volts. So it's either 0, which is a discrete value, or it is real value. It is Gaussian with probability half. Okay, so it's Gaussian with probability half, 0 with probability half. That is what is called a Bernoulli Gaussian. It happens it happens very naturally in practice. Okay, so that's what is called a Bernoulli Gaussian. That is one example for a mixed random variable. Okay, so is that doubt clear?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. So are there any more questions before I proceed? Okay. So what the rest of the talk will be about is the 3 applications that I told you.
Could you give an example for gamma variable?
Yes. You will see lots of examples for gamma. Just hold on. Okay. So the rest of the talk will be about 3 fields that I'll be giving you examples from. One is visual neuroscience, color blindness detection, and COVID-19 modeling. Okay. So all of the images that I have shown on this slide will make sense as I proceed through the talk. Okay. So let's begin with visual neuroscience. Okay. Now I want one person from the audience to volunteer for an experiment that I'll be carrying out. Can any one of you unmute and just reply to me?
And I would volunteer, sir.
Okay, great. So your name?
Yash.
Yash. Okay. So Yash, what I'll be showing you on the next slide is a set of 20 images. Okay. And I would want you to, so out of the 20 images, one of the images will be different. Okay. And your goal is to tell me the location of this image, which is different, as quickly as possible. Okay. Are you ready?
Yes, sir.
So can you tell me where the odd image is?
The fourth from the left and second in the top.
Yes. So the second row and the 4th column. Yes, that's correct. Okay. So I'll request you to volunteer for 2 more such experiments, but with different sets of images. So here's the second set. So can you tell me where the odd image is?
2-2.
Yes, 2-2. And then in this?
4-3, sir.
3-4.
Yeah, 3-4, correct. So typically what people do, so this kind of an experiment was actually carried out by neuroscientists at IAC. Okay, so people typically take a long time on the first set of images that I showed you, slightly lesser time on the second set of images, and this third set is the easiest for them. Okay, so the time that is taken for you to search for the odd image is a function of what we call the oddball and the distractor images. That image which was different is called the oddball image. And all the other images are just for distracting you, okay? Just for distracting you from identifying the odd image. So this search time, okay? The time that you take to search is actually a non-negative valued random variable. You agree? Okay, it cannot, it's a time. So if you measure it in, let's say, seconds or milliseconds, then it's a non-negative real valued random variable. Okay, why is it a random variable? Because its value is not known a priori. Some people take long time, some people take less time. So you'll have to average out many observations to actually come to a conclusion as to what an average value for the search time is. Nonetheless, people are interested in knowing the distribution of this search time. Oh, now why is this distribution important? Because if you can find out the distribution, and if you can find out, let's say, where the mean of the distribution is, where the peak of the distribution is, something like that, that will give you an idea of how long, on an average, a person will take to identify the odd image in this sea of distractor images. And if you repeat this experiment with different sets of images, you will have an idea of how difficult it is for the brain to recognize one odd image in a sea of distractor images when the images themselves keep varying. Okay, so this is something that neuroscientists do a lot. Okay, so this distribution now can be determined with the help of real world data. Okay, so I'll show you some data. So these scientists, so Arun Sharipati is a professor at IISc. He is in the department of, he is in the Center for Neuroscience there. And so he, along with his postdoc advisor, Carl Olsen, they did this experiment on many human subjects. And then they were able to collect this data. Okay, so what data you see on the left is the search time, the amount of time that, Yash, for example, I don't know if many others also volunteered in between, but the amount of time that Yash, for example, took to identify the odd image. Okay, so they were asked to press a button if it's on. So what oddball L here means that if you see the color image on the right here, the color image on the right here, the left one was used as the odd image and the distractor was the right one. Okay, oddball R means that the image on the right was used as the oddball and then the image on the left was the distractor. Like that, they repeated experiments on different individuals. In fact, they repeated it on 6 individuals and they collected 12 measurements from each individual. And these are the, I have just shown the first 14 rows here, but there are 72 rows in all. And then these are the time. These are the times that they recorded in milliseconds. Okay. So now what is the goal? The goal is you will be given data like this. You will have to identify what is the distribution of this data. Okay. So what we do typically as data analysts, what we typically do is, so I have just included a small snippet of a Python code I wrote. So you just divide the entire data into 2 halves. One you call it as a training data, other you call it as a test data. Okay. Now on the test data, you try to estimate the parameters of the distribution. Now what distribution do you fit is the question. For that, what do you do is, you just look at the empirical distribution of the data. What does empirical distribution of the data mean? There is something called a histogram. Okay, I don't know if many of you are aware of what a histogram is. Histogram just means the empirical frequency with which the numbers that you saw on the previous slide occur in the data. For example, how many times out of all the 72 data points, how many data points are between 300 and 400? How many data points are between 400 and 500? How many data points are there between 500 and 600? It need not be 100-100 gap. That bin size you can vary. For example, how many data points are there between 350 and 550? How many data points are there between 550 and 700? Something like that. You can just keep on varying the bin sizes and you can bin your data and then you can compute how many data points fall within each bin. Okay. So what I have done here is I have taken the number of bins as 100, and I think the first bin starts at maybe I guess it starts somewhere around 250 or so. Okay, so I have just computed the bins. Okay, the bin sizes, or maybe it starts at 375 only. Okay, it starts at 375 because I think the first point is 375. So it starts at 375. So it just goes on. Okay, so I have binned the data and then I have computed how many fall within each bin, and the y-axis, that number, the number which falls within each bin, I have normalized it by the total number of data points, which is 72. Okay, so what you see is the fraction of data points which fall within each bin. Okay, now if you see this data, okay, if you see this histogram, you see that there is a peak somewhere and then there is a fall. Yes, so all of you are able to see that there is a peak somewhere. So see, this is a very skewed data because out of the 72, I have randomly sampled 36 data points and then I have computed this histogram based only on those 36 data points. Okay, so that is why it is very skewed, but don't bother about that. The pattern is clearly visible. Okay, there is a peak somewhere and then it falls. Okay, now this is something that is characteristic of a gamma distribution. Okay, this is something that is characteristic of a gamma distribution. In fact, these neuroscientists carried out experiments on more individuals with more data, and they were able to see that peak, which is not at zero. If the peak is at zero, then it may be exponential distribution, but the peak is not at zero. The peak is somewhere up, away from zero, okay? Because nobody took 0 seconds to identify. Nobody could immediately identify the odd image. All of them took some positive time to identify the odd image. Okay, so there is a peak away from zero, and that is a characteristic of a gamma distribution. So let's try to fit a gamma distribution. Now, what gamma distribution will you fit? You have to estimate the parameters of the gamma distribution. Recall that there are two parameters. One is called the shape parameter, another is called the rate parameter or the scale parameter. So you have to first estimate these parameters from the data and then try to fit a gamma distribution with the estimated parameters. So how do you estimate the parameters? As I told, I divided the data into two halves. One I call the training data, one I call the test data. From the test data, whatever I have, I will compute the average search time. I will compute the mean of the search times, and then I will also compute the standard deviation of the search times. So once I have the mean and the standard deviation, now this is where the computations are very important. You should know how to compute the mean, you should know how to compute the standard deviation. And then once you have the mean and the standard deviation, Wikipedia will tell you what is the formula for the shape, formula for the mean, and formula for the standard deviation in terms of the shape and the rate parameters. So you just use those formulas. So it turns out that sample mean divided by sample variance will give you the rate parameter. Okay, you can just refer Wikipedia. This you will get in Wikipedia, but nobody will tell you this particular procedure. This is where your probabilistic ideas should be strong. Okay, so you divide the data and then you estimate the parameters from the data. So rate parameter and the shape parameter, I have given the formulas here. Okay, I have just given the formulas here. So once you do this, you just fit a data, and then you should output how good is this fit. Okay, how good is this fit is something that you should report, because once you fit, you can fit any distribution, right? I could have fit exponential distribution because these are non-negative valued random variables. I could have fit exponential distribution. So if you fit a gamma distribution, you should tell me how good is that fit. And one way to tell how good a fit is through what is called a KS test or a Kolmogorov-Smirnov test. Okay, there are two outputs from a Kolmogorov-Smirnov test. I'm not going into the details. These numbers are not important. But the point I wanted to convey through this slide is that it's a gamma distribution that fits the data well. Okay, and the way we come up with that is by looking at the histogram of the data. Okay, so this is where a gamma naturally enters. The search time, the amount of time you have to wait in order to identify the odd image, is a gamma distributed random variable. Mostly it fits well. Okay, mostly it is a gamma distributed random variable. Is that okay? So this is just one aspect of out of the three applications, this is one thing that I wanted to tell you. Okay, so this is in the way that I have tried to understand all of these. I hope this makes sense. If you have any questions, you can please ask. Okay, so I'll now move to colorblindness. Okay, so I'll just tell you very briefly about what colorblindness is and how probability comes in identifying colorblindness. Okay, so I hope many of you are able to identify the numbers here. These are called Ishihara cards. And then if you go to some eye clinic and if you take a colorblindness test, they will give you cards like these and you have to identify them immediately. So for people who don't have color blindness, they'll be able to identify the numbers immediately. For those of you who have, you will find it difficult. Okay. So about 5% of the people cannot spot the numbers in these cards. Okay. And these 5% are predominantly males. Okay. That's the interesting part. And then, so the question is, what causes this color blindness? Okay. So people are unable to identify, mostly people are not able to distinguish between red and green. Okay. If there is a green in a sea of red, or if there is a light green in a sea of yellow, people are not able to identify that. So yellow, by the way, is a combination of red and green. I hope you're aware of that. So it is this red and green which cause that problem. Okay. So what causes this problem basically? So you have to go back to your eyes. Okay. So in the eyes, there are these color receptors which are called rods and cones. Okay. These rods and cones are what are responsible for perceiving the colors. And then, so these rods and cones, like any other cell in the body, are just cells. And as you know, in each cell, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes. Okay, the last pair of chromosomes will be XX in females. One they would have got from the mother, one they would have got from the father, and the other is XY. Okay, again, one from the mother, one from the father. The Y comes from the father. Okay, so this is what it is. And then the recipe for identifying the red color and the green color is actually present in the 23rd chromosome, specifically in the X chromosome. Okay, the X chromosome, by the way, every chromosome is just a sequence of A, C, G, and T. Okay, it's just like a huge book filled with ACGT in some sequence. If you read off some sequence, that the brain will be able to interpret as color, red color. If there is some other sequence, it will be able to identify, it will be able to read that off as a recipe for green color. That is how the recipes work in the genes. Okay, so as you can see, the red and the green wavelengths are actually very close to each other. Okay, if you see the M and the L wavelengths, they're actually quite close to each other. Now the point is that if the peaks of these two wavelengths come very close to each other, then there is a problem. Then that is where there is an inability to distinguish between the red and the green colors. Okay, so where is all of this information present? Inside the X chromosome. Inside the X chromosome, there is something called exons. Okay, and exons carry the recipe for interpreting colors as red and green. Okay, now the recipes for interpreting red and green actually differ only in 15 places. So out of the 6 exons I have shown you here, by the way, please remember L and M mean red and green. Okay, L and M simply mean red and green. Okay, so the recipes for interpreting green and red colors actually differ only in 15 places. Okay, specifically in exons 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so the problem arises in what is called a crossover between, so this is something that happens in the mothers. Okay, in the mothers, in a female, there will be 2 X chromosomes, and each X chromosome will have the recipes for red and green colors. Okay, so what I have shown here is a crossing over between the 2 X chromosomes. Okay, when a crossover happens between the 2 X chromosomes, it results in 2 new genes. Okay, it results in 2 new genes as shown here. So if there is a crossover that happens like this, you have to join the black with the black and the orange with the orange to get these 2 combinations. Now you see how corrupted these 2 are. These are not as pure as the original ones. Okay, and it so happens that when something like this happens, it results in bringing the red and the green curves closer to one another. Okay, and that is why this color blindness typically happens is observed mostly in males. Why is that? Because this crossing over, even though it happens in females, there will be another X chromosome which can mask its effect. But in the males, because it's a Y chromosome, if this kind of a crossed over gene passes on to a male, the Y chromosome will be incapable of masking the effect of this corrupted gene. Okay, and that is why this color blindness is mostly observed in males. Okay, it's not that it's just in males, it's mostly observed in males. Okay, so why am I telling you all this? Where is probability here? So people have found out from previous data through genetic sequencing. There's something called next generation DNA sequencing, NGS. So through the genetic sequencing, people have found out that there are 4 very, very likely exon configurations which lead to color blindness. Okay, in the sense, from the genetic sequences of people who are colorblind, you will know whether you're colorblind or not when you take those tests. Okay, so if you know you're colorblind, you go get your DNA sequenced, okay, and you give the data to the NGS team, and then that NGS team will collect all this data, and then they have come up with this configuration, these 4 most likely configurations that are typically observed in colorblind people. Okay, now the thing is, the current state of the art genetic sequencing machines cannot read off the entire genetic sequence and see whether there is, I mean, color blindness is something that's there in some patterns inside the genetic sequence. Okay, some sequences of ACGTs is what leads us to becoming colorblind. Okay, so it's very difficult to like read off the entire thing and find out which sequence exactly is the one causing colorblindness, because I still remember when I took this data analytics course at IISc, we were given this X chromosome data from a healthy individual. And then that X chromosome data was just a TXT file. It was a notepad document having ACGTs that came up to 1.2 GB. Okay, you won't believe that. Just a .txt file coming to 1.2 GB. Never in my life had I handled a TXT file with 1.2 GB. My laptop used to hang up just because I was not able to open that TXT file at all. Okay, so typically it consumes too much of memory and it's computationally very intensive to process the entire sequence. So what do? They break the entire sequence into chunks. Okay, and these chunks are what are called reads. Now this is where probability comes in. Okay, so these reads, where do you break this sequence? Okay, so you should explore that sequence very well. Otherwise, you won't be able to find out those particular patterns which lead to color blindness. And therefore, what the genetic sequencing machine will do is it will try to go to random locations on the sequence, and then it will sample a short 100 length character, 100 length sequence of ACGTs at those locations. Okay, so this entire huge sequence, 1.2 GB text file, you go to a random location in the text file and take only 100 characters from there, 100 continuous ACGT sequence from there. Okay, so you take many such reads. Typically, if it will be like 100 million reads or so, okay, but each of them is only 100 characters in length. So this is okay, this can be stored. Okay, so you just take each of these reads, and then what you do is you compare these reads with the reference sequence. Okay, you try to make alignments with the reference sequence. There are very nice techniques in computer science using pointers and substack trees and all that, where you can do these nice alignments. So you do these alignments and you see how many reads match with the exon locations. Okay, so when you have a certain exon configuration, how many reads match under each of the exon locations is what you typically count. Okay, note that these are numbers, these are integers. Okay, how many reads match under each of the exon locations. So let's say there are totally let's say there are totally n reads. Okay, so let's say there are totally n reads, and then there are 6 red exons and 6 green exons. So what happens is, the 2 green exons here, okay, they typically are the same. Okay, so if there is a match with any one of the green exons, it is characterized as a match under one of the exons. So it is just counted as the count under, for example, exon 2 of green. Okay, so you just maintain a count of all of these exon reads, and once you do this, okay, there are 12 numbers that you will get based on the matchings. Okay, x1 through x12 for exon 1 through 6 of red, 1 through 6 of green. Okay, from the data you know the values for these k1 through, sorry, this has to be k12. Okay, so you know the values for the number of, so is that clear? What k1 through k12 are, is that clear? K1 through k12 are just the number of reads that align with the exon locations from exon 1 through 6, exon 1 through 6 of red and green. 12 of them in all. Okay, so totally there are n. Some of them go to exon 1 of red, some of them go to exon 2 of red, some of them go to exon 3 of red, like that. Some of them will go to exon 6 of green, like that. So now you can see there is a natural distribution which comes. This is something like number of people in the theater. Some of them go to door 1, some of them go to door 2, some of them go to door 3. Okay, so let's say the total length is something like this, capital L. Okay, now what people do is, assuming that the reads are sampled uniformly at random, uniformly randomly sampled from the original sequence. Okay, so remember that there is a reference sequence that is that of a healthy individual, and then for a person who is colorblind, from his genetic sequence, short reads are sampled, 100 character reads are sampled from his genetic sequence. And now these are like small reads from the original genetic sequence of the colorblind person. These have to be put together like a jigsaw puzzle to identify where colorblindness is. Okay, so you compare it with the original sequence, the healthy sequence, the healthy person's sequence, and then you find out the number of reads. And using these numbers, what can you do? How can you say what configuration is the most likely for colorblindness? Remember, I showed you 4 configurations before. In one of the slides, I showed you 4 configurations. So if this is the first configuration, okay, so there is 1 red, 2 green exons. Okay, it's like that. And so you have to find out how many of them, you already know how many of them have aligned under each of these exons. Okay, now you just have to compute what is the probability of observing these numbers, observing the number of reads that have attached or that have aligned themselves with each of the exons, given that this is the actual configuration. Okay, and this is just a multinomial. Okay, L1 is the length of exon 1 of read, exon 1 of red. Okay, L1 is the length of the exon 1 of red. Capital L is the total length of all the exons. Okay, so L1 by capital L is the probability that your read will fall within exon 1 of red. Okay, L12 divided by capital L is the probability that your read will fall under exon 6 of green. It's like that. Okay, now these L1 through L12 numbers will not be the same for all the configurations. That you have to note. Okay, for example, in this second configuration here, which has occurred as a result of crossing over, notice that exons 4, 5, and 6 of red are missing. Okay, exons 4, 5, 6 of red are missing. In fact, I should have also written that X5 and L5 and K5 are also 0. X3 is the number. Yeah. X3 is the random variable representing red exon 3. Okay, X4 is red exon 4. Similarly, red exon 5, red exon 6 are also 0. Okay, so based on this, the capital L will vary. Once the capital L varies, this probability will automatically vary. Okay, so just try to do this on your own. Okay, just try to do these computations on your own. I'm just going to leave them as exercise. But the point is that you have 4 configurations and you try to compute these probabilities and you see which of these probabilities is the largest. Okay, the probability which is the largest is the configuration that is most likely to induce colorblindness. Okay, this is the best that can be done. Okay, once you know that the person is colorblind, because it is almost impossible to pinpoint which sequence exactly is contributing to colorblindness, you know that this kind of a configuration is the most likely that is causing the colorblindness. Okay, so this is what people actually do in practice. And all of these, whatever I have shown here, are actually done in a company called Strand Life Sciences. Okay, so one of the faculty who taught us data analytics, his name is Ramesh Hariharan. He is one of the co-founders of that company. It's called Strand Life Sciences. It's a very interesting field. Genomic sequencing and probability plays a very, very central role there. The only way you can say which configuration is causing colorblindness is actually probabilistically. Okay, with this, this is the configuration that is most likely to induce colorblindness. Okay, this is the way people actually do this genetic sequencing and identify which configuration of exons actually leads to colorblindness. Okay, so just a quick time check. I think I have 5 more minutes, right? Mahesh sir?
Yes, Karthik. Yes, Karthik.
Okay, so in these 5 minutes, I just want to give you a very, very, very brief idea about how probability actually comes in COVID-19, modeling the spread of COVID-19. Okay, so so this is an ongoing epidemic because of which all of us have met here virtually. And then as of yesterday, the number of cases is about 6 million in India. And probabilistic models, where do they enter in this epidemic modeling? Typically, probabilistic models are used for predicting the number of cases in the future. Why do you have to predict the number of cases in the future? So that hospitals and other intensive care units can prepare themselves to handle the peak load of patients who may come in. Okay, so these models will try to tell us when exactly the peaks may occur. Okay, these may of course be off from reality, but these will usually give us an idea about when exactly these peaks may come, so that the hospitals and intensive care units and the government can be prepared to handle that. Okay, so many of them actually ask me, why did the government actually impose a lockdown? Okay, what was the necessity of that when people actually don't follow social distancing, when people actually don't wear masks, they wear masks below the chin. So what is the point of doing all of this? So the point is the government actually imposed a 40-day lockdown in India. Karnataka happened even before the national lockdown happened. That was mainly so this is something that I've heard from one of the epidemiologists on a Kannada podcast. Okay, so he says that it actually helped the government prepare for the intensity of the pandemic, that would later come out. So for them to prepare themselves is what a lockdown is mostly meant for. Okay, and certainly it is a non-pharmaceutical intervention, NPI, that can contain the spread of the epidemic. Okay, if the compliance is very nice from the people side, if people comply very well with the standards, then certainly it will help in containing the spread of the epidemic. Okay, so there are many models which are used for predicting these numbers of cases in the future. One of them is just to look at the data and then fit a curve using regression or some other technique, and then you estimate the parameters of that curve. Okay, those parameters will tell you what exactly may happen in the future. So from the data, you actually learn the parameters, you fit the curve, you fit a nice curve, and then use that to predict the numbers in the future. So that is one curve fitting technique. There is one another technique where you actually model the spread of the epidemic itself. Okay, so you categorize the whole population into 4 groups: susceptible, exposed, infected, recovered. This is what is called a SEIR model. Okay, so there is a certain probability with which an individual who is susceptible will go to exposed. There is a certain probability with which an individual who is exposed becomes infected. There is a certain probability with which an individual who is infected becomes recovered. Okay, but the problem with this model, SEIR model, is that it doesn't take age-related factors into account. So when a person who is infected has to recover, age also plays a very important role. It doesn't take that into account. There is where agent-based models will come into play. Agent-based models are a very microscopic model. They are very microscopic models which will take into account the distribution of the population in the whole city. So in an agent-based model, what you will typically do is you will divide the whole city into wards. You will understand how the population is distributed in each ward, how many houses are there, where are those houses located, and then in each house, what is the distribution of the ages of all the people who are residing in that house. All of this can be gotten from the census data. That census data is taken as it is, and then it is incorporated into creating a synthetic city through a simulator. Okay, so there is a city scale simulator which is actually built. There are many city scale simulators, but I am going to talk about one specific simulator that I have come to know. This is from a team from IISc Bangalore and TIFR Mumbai. So what they do is they create a synthetic city like Bangalore. Okay, they did this for Bangalore, Mumbai, New York, Wuhan, and then I think they have also now done it for Kochi. Okay, so they create a synthetic Bangalore on the computer. Okay, just when I say Bangalore, it's almost Bangalore. Okay, like 198 wards, 1.23 crore population distributed across these 198 wards, all of this, but on a smaller scale. Maybe they do it for 1 lakh or 10 lakh, but this is respected. This particular demography is respected. Okay, so the simulator is based on the synthetic city and things like that. So what they do is they instantiate n individuals inside that city, that artificial city that they create based on the actual demographics from census data, and then they will infect the virus to one person or some people in the city, artificial city, and they will see how the COVID will spread. Now that how COVID will spread is something that you have to create in the simulation. How do you do that so that it is actually something that is close to reality? Okay, so this is where there are some prior works which have actually studied the COVID-19 situation. Okay, and what they have said is, so there is an artificial city, there are people, you inject the virus to some people, now it has to spread, right? This virus has to spread. You have to simulate the spread of the virus within this artificial city. How do you do that? What you do is, all of these are random variables. Okay, now once an individual is infected, in the sense once an individual is exposed to the virus, the amount of time that he takes to become infectious, okay, to spread it to others, is modeled as a gamma distributed random variable. So you see how naturally gamma comes as the incubation time also. Okay, how is it gamma? This is based on prior data which has been acquired from Wuhan and New York and other places. Okay, based on the number of hospital beds, based on the number of people who show up at the hospitals. There is a large amount of work which is done in the background, but at the end there is a probabilistic model that we can very nicely use to simulate a synthetic COVID spread in our synthetic city. Okay, so The incubation period is a gamma random variable, okay? And the shape parameter is 2 and the scale parameter is 2.29, okay? All these are from prior data. I have given the references to the papers here, okay? Now, once an individual becomes infectious, the amount of time he will take, okay? So once an individual becomes infectious, he will hold on that infection for an exponentially distributed period of time. What is the parameter of the exponential distribution? 0.5 days. Okay, all these are from data. Just like how I showed you a Python code and I fit a gamma distribution earlier, like the people have done this already, and I'm just reporting the results. Okay, so these results are actually used in the simulator. They simulate this like this. They simulate after a mean period of 0.5 days, there is an infection which starts to show up like that. Individuals are infectious for this much of time. So they the team from IAC and TFR have done is to assume that 2/3 of the infectious people will show symptoms, 1/3 of them will recover. I think this is based on the age strata of the population. Okay. Now, once the individuals of the 2/3 of the total population, the amount of time that the individuals take to actually show the symptoms, starting from the day on which they become infectious, that is a random variable. You don't know after how many days you will show the symptoms. People have modeled that as an exponentially distributed random variable with mean of 5 days. Okay, so there is no hard and fast rule that incubation period is gamma. Okay, and the mean time to show the symptoms is exponential. It is based on the fit of the data. Okay, so you do a KS test and you see that the data is fitting very well for this distribution. That is how you use the distribution. So using all these distributions, you actually do the simulator, entire simulator. Okay, so I urge all of you to go to this website that I have given here. Okay, you can run the simulation for the whole of Bangalore city. There are in fact there are many NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, like what will happen if there is a lockdown which is imposed for 40 days. Okay, after which there is home quarantine and self-isolation for people who are above the age of 60 years. So like this, you can actually study the impact of NPIs on the actual spread of the epidemic. Okay. Now, it's very important to note that all these numbers, that is this 4.58 mean incubation period, gamma, and then this 0.5 days exponential, okay, 5 days exponential, 2/3 of the population showing symptoms once they catch the infection. All of this has to be tuned online as and when data comes. Okay, these people have not yet done it. Okay, but as and when the data comes in, because I think there are now about 2.3 lakh cases, if I'm not wrong, okay, in Bangalore. So based on the data that comes in, they have to update these parameters. Only then the actual numbers will reflect. Okay, otherwise the actual numbers will not reflect. Okay, so don't go by the numbers that these models are showing. Okay, why do people have simulators like this? Is because it helps the government to evaluate the effect of imposing a lockdown. Whether a lockdown should be imposed or not, if you want to arrive at a decision like that, then a simulator like this will tell you what will happen if there is no lockdown, what will happen if there is a lockdown. Okay, so it has to be used for such training purposes. Okay, it should not be used for medical diagnostic purposes or for treating people. It should not be used for such things. Okay, the numbers reported here may be far off from reality, but the whole point of simulators is just to give an idea of what is the impact of NPIs. Okay, so I'll just conclude with some bibliography. I'll just tell you where I have taken the material from. Okay, so I've just mentioned all of these here, the images where I have taken, and then the visual neuroscience images and the data set that I showed you, that 72-point data set that I showed you, it is from the data analytics course that is taught at IISc, which I also took. So it is there. It is linked on I have given the link to the web page. And then the colorblindness slides are also from Ramesh Hariharan's Strand Life Sciences slides, which are also linked on the data analytics course. And then this COVID-19 spread modeling is from my own advisors team. Professor Rajesh Sundaresan from IAC was coordinating this effort. And then there was Professor Sandeep Juneja and Prahalad Harsha and others at TIFR Mumbai who are coordinating the effort from there. It's a very big team. They have done a commendable effort actually. So I urge you to look at this full detailed report on the COVID-19 spread modeling, how they actually created this synthetic city, what effort went into creating that city, what programming languages have they used for this. It was mostly built on Python, Plotly, and all the plots that you see here are on Python Plotly. Okay, so they have given all the detail. All the details are there. What programming languages did they use? And they have hosted it on the server within IISc. There is a Center for Network Intelligence where there is a server, and they hosted it on that server only. Okay, so you will not be routed to any foreign network. You can be within India and you can access all of this. So I just thought I'll give you the links to all of this. And if there is any mistake that you found on any of the slides, it's completely on me. Okay, thanks so much for listening to me patiently. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Karthik. I think you covered all the engineering applications, practical applications of probability and random variables, where they come, how gamma is coming naturally in COVID situation. Thank you very much. So we teach only communication applications of probability and random variables, but you covered all
yeah, so
other
that is why I did not actually go to cover communication aspects in detail, because anyway they would be learning this. I just wanted to give some applications from the industry, how data analysis, how it's used in data analytics, and other places. So,
yes,
yeah.
yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Karthik. From Department of ECE, Electronics and Communication, and RV College of Engineering, we would like to thank you, and I thank all the participants for your time. And thank you very much, Karthik. Thank you.
Yeah. So if anyone wants to
Let's stop.
get back to me on,
Yeah,
if anyone has any doubt,
any
you want to
clarifications,
get
because
back to
only
me.
one or two only asked. But if you have any doubt, you can ask now, or you can write it to Karthik also.
Yeah, you can
Can we mail you?
write to
So
me.
can we mail you?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So I'll be making these slides available on my webpage. Okay, so you can have a look at the slides. So Mahesh sir, will I be having access to the recording of this talk?
Yes, I will provide the access. And the web page is, I'm typing in the chat box, https://karthikpn.com. It is available in the chat box.
Yes.
So that is his web page. And this
So
talk is recorded,
I'll
and it will
also try
be.
to link. Yeah, I'll also try to make the recording available on my website if I'm able to get access to that. I'll definitely make the slides available.
Okay, Karthik. Thank you very much. If any doubts are there, participants, you can ask, or we'll close the session.
Yeah, I'll wait for some time if anyone wants to ask anything. Else we can close.
So one doubt regarding how the model was made. The model was made taking, this is pertaining to the COVID model. The model was made pertaining to the data collected from Wuhan, and politically, I don't think that all the data is available from what has happened with Wuhan. So
yeah, so actually there was also this report that was released from I think Oxford, if I'm not wrong. So they had linked it. They had linked some data sets in their report, and I think some of that data has also been used. So there is actually a full list of references in that in this report on arXiv. There is a full list of references from where they have actually taken these data. But most of it was based on the Bangalore and Mumbai data itself. So the thing is, they wanted to understand what opening of trains in Mumbai will do to the spread of the pandemic and things like that. So that is where the goal was from Mumbai's perspective. In Bangalore, it was mostly about trying to understand, because Bangalore had already gone into lockdown much before the nationwide lockdown was imposed. So the goal was mostly to understand what kind of a phased reopening should be done so as to contain the spread. Most of the research indicated that it should be phased opening, in the sense you open, let the numbers peak, impose a lockdown, open, let the numbers peak, impose a lockdown, and things like that. This was the way it was actually told in the beginning. But I think now the course of the pandemic has also changed. As I said, I don't think they have incorporated, I don't think they have updated the parameters of this gamma distribution and all of that in their simulator based on the data. They have not done that actually. I think they have admitted that in the report itself. So, but once the pandemic starts, it's as if those parameters, I think they can be used, because the virus, it affecting me here in Bangalore versus it affecting me there in Wuhan, I don't think there's that much of a difference on an individual basis. So because these are
a difference in terms of how the reaction would be, because in Wuhan nothing was expected, and then it was quite you can say quite instantaneous, whilst here you know what's going to happen with you and you know what to expect.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I agree with that. So I mean, one thing is to first get started, get the city to start modeling this pandemic, and then later update the parameters based on the actual data you receive from Bangalore or from Mumbai. Actually, Bangalore, the cases did not rise until a certain point of time because there was a lockdown. The numbers were too less to carry out simulation. This is where I refer to it as the frequentist approach. This is where frequentist approach fails. Your probabilities or whatever computations you do, if there are only 1,000, 10,000 data or 1,000 or 1,500 data points, you may not actually get good estimates. Yeah. Only if you have like 2 lakh parameters or maybe even 1 million parameters, something like that, that is where it starts to make sense. So initially Bangalore had very, very small numbers. Only after that lockdown was lifted, did the numbers actually start to rise once these workers actually started migrating. So once that happened, I think that's where the numbers started to rise. But you're right. You cannot directly up. Yeah, sorry.
I think that's understandable to that.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, one thing is to get started, and the other thing is to update the parameters along the way. So I don't think they have done that other part. I think they are still working on that. If I'm not wrong, they're still working on it. Most of them are PhD students. So there is some effort that is going here, and then there is also some other effort towards their own thesis work. So I think they are taking some time to do it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I think the key takeaway for many of us here is that it is not just probability that is important. It is also being able to code well. Okay, all of these doesn't come without good coding effort. And data analysts typically, for example, at least the companies that I know which come to IAC for placements, they typically, they don't ask you pointers and all that. Okay, what they ask you is they will give you a task like this. They will ask you, are you in a position to fit the data? Are you in a position to extract the parameters and report the parameter values to me immediately? Okay, and the code has to be as automated as possible. Tomorrow, if the data is refreshed, if new data comes in, if the Excel, so let's say you have stored all of the data in an Excel file or a CSV file, and then new data keeps coming in, new number of cases keep coming in, those numbers keep getting updated. Your parameters have to keep getting updated in an online fashion. So estimating the parameters requires probabilistic modeling. That is where the role of probabilists will come. And then if you also understand the theory well, you will be able to extract nice interpretations out of these parameters that you get. One thing is to just write a code and then get the values. The other thing is to interpret what these values mean in the context of the current pandemic. Okay, so this is where probabilistic modeling is very important, and math is very important there.
Right, understandable.
Yeah.
Thank you, Karthik. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, I hope I have. I hope I have done a good job in conveying some things to you. So if you want any more clarifications, you can get back to me. You can write to me.
Thank you, Karthik. We'll close the meeting. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, sir. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.